Welcome to the Middle East 101 Lecture Series 2023. This lecture series gives you a comprehensive overview of the Middle East region and its impacts on Singapore and the world. Today's lecture is the fifth in this series, which is a continuation of the segment dedicated to economic and social challenges in the regions, in the Middle East region. So today we focus on the changing Gulf by delving into the region's domestic politics and social reforms. This lecture will be presented by my colleague, Dr. Clemens Che. My name is Asif Shuja, and I will be the moderator for the day. Since this lecture is being conducted both in person and online via Zoom, once we enter the question and answer round, the participants physically present here in this room may raise their hands to ask questions and wait for this mic to come. The online participants may send in their questions to the event team through the Zoom chat box. Let me now briefly introduce today's presenter. Dr. Clemens Che is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. His research focuses on the history and politics of the Gulf states with a particular emphasis on Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar. At MEI, he spearheads a highly successful public education series entitled Bridging the Gulf. His recent academic publications include a chapter that examines Kuwait's parliamentary politics in the Routledge Handbook of Persian Gulf Politics, a chapter in the edited volume Informal Politics in the Middle East, and a study appearing in the Journal of Arabian Studies titled The Diwania Tradition in Modern Kuwait, an Interlinked Space and Practice. His commentaries also feature across different outlets, including Italian Institute for International Political Studies, King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, and Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. That amounts to a scholarly outreach to 3 continents. He is currently working on a book project related to Kuwait's Diwaniyas, affectionately known as Diwawin, and more widely known as Majlis outside Kuwait. The reception rooms for informal meetings that have implications for society, politics, and diplomacy. Prior to joining MEI, Dr. Che was the Al Sabah Fellow at Durham University, where he taught and completed his PhD in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and where he also received an MSc in Defense Development and Diplomacy. He is also a Sciences Po Paris alumnus. Having read his BA at the Menton campus, Clemens is amongst those dedicated Singaporeans who have illustrated exemplary scholarship on Middle East and Gulf region. With this introduction, I hand over the floor to Clemens, please.
Thank you, Asif. Thank you for this comprehensive introduction. And it's good to see people in the crowd today and also online. Today, I'm going to talk about the domestic policies and social reforms in the Gulf Arab states, and I'm going to share my slides with you right now. Gulf Arab states. Last year, I was talking about the geopolitics of the region, 2 somewhat different angles, but still on the same sub-region of the Middle East, the oil-rich states of the region. And of course, the angle is very different because last year we were talking about interstate relations, and now we're talking about what's going on inside the countries, the 6 countries that we are actually going to be looking at today, some more than others. There are 6. There will be the Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. So 6 of them. And of course, they are in the middle of socio-economic transformations. And I wanted to let you know what went on in my mind when I was preparing these slides. So if you look at, the slide in front of you right now, there was a very brief outline that I had for the presentation today. And what went through my head was, it's just a mind map of concepts, which obviously is going to tie down with what happens on the ground. And if you look at the slide in front of you, you realize that some of them are theories, and I think theories that are very relevant to the region. Some are long-held concepts in the literature, and we want to see how we can update them, or of course correct certain misconceptions. If you look at it, we have suburbanization / urbanization, we have rentier theory, we have the family unit, which has now come back into prominence. It's all along been there, of course, but I'm saying that it's being at the tip of people's tongues at the minute. There's economic diversification, which is the long-standing hot topic because of the fact that these are oil states, and the question is when and how are they going to move away from the oil sector and produce a high level of non-oil income. So if you look at the bottom right, I put on a number of themes, including oil and gas, which will be covered next week by another speaker. Last week, we had climate change by my colleague, Dr. Aisha Al-Sarihi. And there are all these interconnecting themes that, of course, today will be, I intend to cover and try to link them all together in a way. So, outline of today's presentation, we have to cover a little on the historical context of the Gulf states. We'll start with the most visual of all, the visual of all slides, which is the development in terms of spatial development, urbanization, modernization, and how things change in terms of the physical landscape from the past to the present. Okay, we're fine. And then we'll look into the visions, because every country has a vision right now. There's Saudi Vision 2030, there's Kuwait Vision 2035. The Emiratis have gone on to develop a centennial plan for 2071. So there's various visions. Of course, the question is whether they can achieve it, and what's the report card on the way to achieving what they set out in these visions or the documents tied to these visions. Of course, there's going to be economic competition because of that similar resource that every one of them has, some more than others. But, the competition then is about who can attract the best investments, who can attract the most skilled foreign professionals, and who will be leading the race. And of course, the final bit is updating rentier theory, which I will come to that when we get there. Then we talk about the family, because the question is, if you have such economic transformation, how does this impact society? Or how does society respond to these economic policies within their respective political systems or within their respective, kinship systems? We'll come to that, and you can see we talk a lot about kinship at the end, including nationalism, how some of these economic policies actually, produces a sense of localized nationalism on the ground. Like I said, we're going to start spatially, in terms of space, how things have developed since independence or even pre-independence, and the kind of urbanization that took place. This is in Kuwait. The bottom right box of your screen is actually the 1952 master plan. It starts from the coast, because the first part of the development is on the top left box, where you see that there was a small settlement or small port by the coast or by the shore, where obviously you would have guessed that maritime trade will be the main, the main kind of activities that went on and the main source of income at that time. And we are talking about now pre-1950s until the master plan was developed. We're talking about pearling, shipbuilding. We're talking about, sea captains, that whole line of occupational trade that is tied in with the sea. And you see the development, and you see, from the left to the right, as they move inland, the sea trade is connected to the bazaar or the souk or the market. And then when the 1952 plan was effective, we start to see roads. We start to see, more residential areas. And it's a very similar story for the rest of the Gulf, of course, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, because they are based in the hinterland with a huge and wide desert, vast desert land. So it's a bit different from Saudi Arabia. But then again, the similar kind of urbanization phase occurred across the board. And you see here on your slide, the 1968 Thucydides master plan for Riyadh, which also implemented a kind of system. Kuwait's one was based on ring roads, concentric ring roads, while Riyadh's one was a grid system. And this still stays today. There are, of course, other developments. And if you look at the satellite map, you see the expansion as well, which we saw very similarly to the Kuwaiti kind in the last slide. And I wanted to show you, again, this is very typical of a Gulf city. We are looking at Dubai.
History of Dubai in 50 seconds. Dubai used to be a small fishing village, but its location at the Persian Gulf, a crossing point between East and West, helped it become a big trading hub in the Gulf. By the early 20th century, Dubai's main industry was pearl diving. Dubai's transformation began with Sheikh Rashid, who was inspired by his trip to London in 1959, and started implementing his plan to turn Dubai into an international city. In 1966, oil was discovered in Dubai. Although the oil reserves were quite modest by Middle Eastern standards, they helped Sheikh Rashid implement his dream of turning Dubai into an international city by investing the oil profits in urban development. Sheikh Mohammed, Sheikh Rashid's son, continued his father's work and decided to make Dubai a city of the biggest and tallest structures. He initiated the construction of Dubai International Airport, Dubai Financial Center, as well as Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. His mega projects helped Dubai become the major international hub that it is today. Let me know in the comments if you've been to Dubai.
So in a very short 50-second clip, I think some of the things that we can single out, among others, are number one, pearling, which I've said. Pearl diving was one of the main source of income, the main trades in the region. Oil, the discovery of oil, of course, which for some more than others helped to boost the economy as they move towards independence, and then in the early independence years. Towards a globalist city, which is what happens after urbanization happens. We saw Dubai Financial Center, we saw the airport. And so there's a dream, there's an ambition towards being a hub because of their strategic location between the West and the East. And of course, that's why, hence the term Middle East, because they're right in the middle of the two. And then superlatives being that they want to be, the ambition is there, they want to be the best, they have the tallest structure. Burj Khalifa is one of them, as you saw. And it's not just in Dubai that you find a very similar path, where you start from a very modest pearling town or port city, and then there was the oil discovery, and then now with that money, with the newfound wealth, you build up your city, you build up your country, and you move towards being a global hub. And to show how wealthy you are, or to show how prosperous you are, you start building, the superlatives. So it's a very similar story across the board. I just wanted to make sure that you understand that, with the exception of course, Saudi Arabia, which didn't really go much into pearling, the rest of them were actually very much engaged in maritime trade. So what kind of Gulf city are we talking about? And this, again, is Dubai, an aerial view of Dubai. The question you have to ask yourself, when you have such rapid urbanization across a period of 2 or 3 decades, how is that going to impact or affect the local communities? If you remember the Kuwaiti development or urban development, you saw that it was a very small circle or semicircle of interconnected mud houses at that time. And then what you have today is very, very different than what you saw in the past. So the kind of urbanization that we're talking about, how would it impact the family unit? The family unit, which actually consisted of an extended family living in one courtyard house. And now with, of course, the urban development, they are going to be suburbanized. They're going to be put into different neighborhoods. The car or the automobile is going to be the main form of transport and not your feet. And things are different. I mean, the everyday life is different. To get from one place to another, the car is the main means of taking you from point A to point B. And again, if you think about more recent phenomena, think about COVID-19. How would that change things if it had been, in that kind of interconnected closely knitted community than it is today. So I think these are the kind of thing in terms of urbanism, in terms of society that we want to start thinking about, and the kind of development that these states have gone through in a period of 20, 30 years. Of course, now since independence, it's already been for some 50 to 60s, for some more than that, 80 or 90. If you look at Gulf cities and you characterize them in the Middle East, Yasser El-Sheshtawi, 2008, his book on the evolving Arab city, edited volume really, and his introduction says that there is a great divide between the traditional centers and the emerging cities, what he calls the emerging cities. And the emerging cities are the ones that he says that are the Gulf cities that we are just talking about right now. I think that there must be some nuance to this argument, because his argument is that, Gulf cities are unburdened by history. In other words, no history. We just saw that it was once, they were once port cities. There were once, a kind of organic urbanism by the shore, because everything is connected to maritime trade. So are you saying that because of urbanization and because that you erase that kind of landscape, we are just erasing history completely, altogether? I think there is a kind of problem in this argument, because the kind of urbanism that you found in the past will find its way back into the modern city, but in some other ways. And we will look at that later. The kind of communal spirit what I'm trying to get at will find its way not in terms of the physical landscape, but in something else, which we will cover later. Of course, we talked about the wealth that the Gulf states have, Gulf Arab states have, and this is in comparison with the rest of the Middle East. The circles that you see there is a comparison between population in major cities in the MENA region on the left, and then the GDP per capita on the right. That was in 2008, and the updated figures are in the orange table on the right side of the slide. But you see that, not much have changed, except the fact that, in terms of intra-Gulf differences, things have changed. But by and large, you see that the Gulf cities, in terms of per capita, they are much more well-off than the rest of the Middle East. And if you go into the IMF database, you realize that you are unable to find data for states such as Syria, such as Lebanon, precisely because they are currently having a civil war or in severe crisis, which is why there are no numbers. Like I said, if you look at the orange table, by and large, the Gulf states are taking the lead in terms of GDP per capita, which shows the amount of wealth you have in these countries. And on the subject of oil, and before we dive into more, domestic developments, Gulf energy in the international system is crucial. And I think we in Singapore also realize that, because some of the oil tankers that pass through the Straits of Hormuz, which is a choke point for all vessels, it's a problem if it's blocked, to put it simply. And consumer nations are affected by the price changes that are dictated by OPEC. And even here in Singapore, we follow the prices that are set by OPEC. And if you look again, to reiterate the point, right now, Brent crude oil price is currently at around $90 per barrel, which is obviously helping, I think, which is generating a lot of wealth for the Gulf Arab states. And even more so with the war in Ukraine. I think my colleague, Dr. John Lu Saman, covered that previously, which actually put the Gulf states back in the limelight in terms of the energy crisis, at least for Europe as well, because Qatar, for example, signed a 15-year LNG deal when Europe was thinking, where are they going to get their gas from, apart from Russia? And Qatar comes in and signs the 15-year LNG deal with Germany. And do not forget that we talked about the strategic location of the Gulf Arab states, the fact that 30% of all container trade and 16% of air cargo passes through this region. So I think in these two slides, we are seeing like this prosperity of the region based on not only on energy prices, but also on their strategic geographical location. So we move into domestic policies, diversification, and how that's linked to intra-Gulf competition and also the welfare state and what to make of it. Now, rentier model is a theory that has been there when we talk about the Gulf Arab states. The rentier model says that no representation without taxation. The idea of it is saying that because these states have so much oil wealth, these sources, these revenues will then be redistributed to their population in different forms of welfare benefits. It could be subsidies, it could be plots of land, it could be healthcare benefits, educational subsidies, so on. And in return, because the state is providing so much, the citizens would then provide their allegiance, meaning to say there will be very little dissent and a high level of loyalty. Okay, this is what the theory presumes, of course. But this model requires updating because in recent years, taxation has been introduced precisely because there is increased energy intensity in terms of consumption, domestic consumption. And the Gulf states have been forced to relook at subsidy reform. Tariffs on utilities have been raised across the 2010s. VAT, with the exception of Kuwait and Qatar, like I said, have been imposed. So that there is some kind of economic adjustment. On top of that, you have a very youthful population, which of course wants to see change. And we'll come to that again when we talk about the family, which means that we are also moving towards a sort of generational change. A generation that wants to see things done differently, a generation that hopes for more opportunities, including in employment, and also, seeing the country moving forward in terms of social reforms as well. But one challenge, as you can see on your slide in front of you, is that there remains a public sector bias in terms of national employment, especially thinking that, as we call here the iron rice bowl, but over there, meaning to say that guaranteed job security, a job for life, is still being regarded as employment in the government sector. So if you they believe that if you hold a government job, you'll be paid for life. And that is one challenge in terms of the psyche, the mentality of that needs to be changed. You can say that the country is winning itself off oil, but that to remain competitive, you need to boost both the public and the private sectors. Another clip, and a more recent one.
When you think about the massive wealth of countries in the Gulf, the first thing that comes to mind is oil.
Oil is about so much more than just what's coming out of the ground. Oil is about money, it's about politics, and it's about power.
As oil producers, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain are some of the wealthiest countries in the world. Together, they make up
as well.
Perhaps the Qatar Development Bank CEO, he said it best when he asked, what would we be able to produce if oil and gas did not exist?
I think that when he's saying we have to have something beyond oil to offer the world, he's speaking for every Gulf Arab economy. And it's not something that they don't know, whether it be the volatility in oil prices when they crashed out and went under 40, or even during the global pandemic when they hit almost zero. I mean, this was a situation where we had negative prices for the very first time. And it was one which nobody could have predicted, but certainly galvanized this push to diversification. They're working very hard, though, on these diversification strategies. They've not been unaware that the world is changing, but when you have 80 plus years of oil wealth basically dictating how your economies are running, it's a fast and solid moving freight train that you've literally got to put the brakes on and then reverse.
What Hadley is emphasizing here is that economic diversification from oil is inevitable, and each Gulf country has charted a different course to getting there. For example, there's Saudi Vision 2030, a strategic framework to reduce the state's dependency on oil.
The Vision 2030, instituted a couple of years ago with the ascension of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, really changed the game in a sense, because it brought the opportunity for an IPO of Saudi Aramco, something that nobody thought was going to be possible and which they managed to pull off.
The listing of Saudi Aramco on the Saudi Stock Exchange valued the world's biggest oil and gas company at $1.7 trillion and raised $25.6 billion at the time. That amount fell short of the $100 billion investment Aramco executives were hoping to count on to help diversify the economy away from oil.
So for decades, education beyond religious education was not emphasized.
Okay, so now we just saw this CNBC interview or discussion on the importance of diversification, because you can't rely on oil income forever. And which is why this is an integral part of the different visions, produced by the Gulf Arab states. And notably, if you saw from the clip that we just watched, Saudi Vision 2030 is one of them, under the current Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And I understand from my colleagues that there was a question on NEOM last week. And NEOM is another grandiose project where you're trying to create a sustainable city. If you go and Google the Line project, you'll see that it's a very ambitious project. Whether or not it will meet the targets, that is another question. But there is a sense of optimism in Saudi Arabia right now, and there's a sense of encouragement among the population that the ambitions of the Crown Prince, are forward-looking, and they will produce more opportunities in terms of employment. And these are the kinds of national aspirations that Saudi Arabia wants to achieve. And now, not just from within, the Crown Prince has made moves, in the region, diplomatic moves, to be involved in a whole lot of other initiatives. Of course, I'm not going to go into that because I'm supposed to be sticking to the domestic agenda. But if you can look at the slide in front of you, you see that one of them is a high-speed railway in NEOM that's aimed at connecting different parts of Saudi Arabia. There's also development for the ports, Red Sea resorts, and this doesn't just apply to Saudi Arabia. The UAE, for example, has just launched the Etihad Rail, which has allowed cargo to be transported from one emirate to another. And there are 7 emirates in the UAE, and this newly operational Etihad Rail will aim to transport goods and services around. And of course, the next logical step will be passenger services. And the number of construction and transport contract awards doesn't stop there. They don't stop there. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2022 actually issued the highest number of construction projects in the Gulf. And of course, the sizable portion of this money and contracts goes to NEOM. And this figure surpasses that of giant markets such as Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. And that's the magnitude of development that we are seeing in Saudi Arabia on infrastructure spending, but also with an eye on modernity, because we have Qiddiya being the designated entertainment city, and of course we are aware that women are allowed to drive since 2018, and things have moved on since then. Society, the religious police is no longer patrolling the streets trying to catch people who are not adhering to religious guidelines. We have non-religious tourist visas being issued now, which was formerly not the case. And we also have K-pop. We have Blackpink going to Saudi Arabia earlier this year in January. So you see the kind of development and fast-paced change that we're talking about in Saudi Arabia. Things like entertainment, that once had to be following the guidelines of a fatwa or religious issued kind of declaration, to to follow the declaration, the religious guidelines and things like this. These are now out of the picture. You have things that now Saudi youth consider as moving forward and progressing towards modernity. And you have such projects which show that the country and the leadership is intending to move in that. So transformation, how is this perceived by, of course, its neighbors? Often than not, I hear the phrase, the giant awakens, from some of the officials and residents from the other Gulf states. Because Saudi Arabia, of course, being the custodian of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina, has long been viewed as religiously conservative, adhering to the Wahhabi doctrine of Islam. But then comes a crown prince who tore it all away. And I think amid these developments in terms of infrastructure, resort projects, entertainment cities, I think one of the things that gives people optimism is the investment in human capital. And I think that's been a talk in the region for a long time, that you should teach men to fish rather than get someone to fish for you and bring the fish to your table. I think that's the idea now, that there is an optimism because the current leadership sees that vocational training, improving the skill sets of your nationals is the way to go. And post-oil economy doesn't mean that you just find non-oil income, but you need a radical systemic change. You need a radical change of mindset. And of course, that requires time, and it might require one generation. And the roadmap, as laid out by the vision, is to aspire to become a vibrant society, possess a thriving economy, and remain ambitious along the way. And let's look at another clip. And this one was at the Future Investment Initiative. And these are very, very bold words. And this came out, this resurfaced, it was in 2018, but this resurfaced after the India Middle East corridor concept came out of the latest G20 summit. And this is trending on social media right now.
أنا أعتقد أن أوروبا الجديدة هي الشرق الأوسط. المملكة العربية السعودية في ال5 سنوات القادمة سوف تكون مختلفة تماما. البحرين سوف تكون مختلفة تماما. الكويت، حتى قطر على خلافنا معاهم لديهم اقتصاد قوي سوف تكون مختلفة تماما بعد 5 سنوات. الإمارات، عمان، لبنان، الأردن، مصر، العراق والفرص التي لديها. إذا نجحنا في ال5 سنوات القادمة سوف تلتحق فينا دول أكثر، وسوف تكون النهضة القادمة في العالم في 30 سنة القادمة في الشرق الأوسط إن شاء الله. هذه حرب السعوديين، هذه حربي اللي أخوضها شخصيا، ولا أريد أن أفارق الحياة إلا وأرى الشرق الأوسط في مقدمة مصاف في العالم، وأعتقد أن هذا الهدف سوف يتحقق 100%.
الله يعطيك طول العمر يا سيدي.
So you see the kind of ambition by the Saudi leadership at the minute. Of course, this was 2018, and he said 5 years. So of course, we are still witnessing the change, and something that you will go beyond 2030, which is what the vision sets out. But one thing's for sure, Saudi Arabia has moved on the regional arena, even in the global arena, to take the lead in many things. And of course, led by the Crown Prince, who is, of course, leading the Gulf Summit, the GCC Summit, the Middle East Green Initiative, among others. And so there's a sense that putting the country's hands in a very young leadership, is the wise move. Of course, the man himself, has credit is owed to the man himself, because he maneuvered his way up. And he, of course, rivals and push foes out of the way in order to be in the position that he is right now. Okay, so besides Saudi Arabia, I think we just saw what the Saudi vision is about. Does that mean that the other Gulf Arab states are behind? The answer is no. And I think the rest are not resting on their laurels, in particular the UAE. The UAE has always been at the forefront of economic development, economic growth. Dubai has always been their star on the global stage. But you see that the Saudis are trying to play catch up. You see that we had Dubai Expo, which has already passed. Now the Saudis want to do Riyadh Expo 2030. And that's why you see hosting mega events. One of them, the Qataris have done the World Cup, of course, we all know that. And hosting mega events is one way of putting yourself on the map. We have things like the Bloomberg Economic Forum, all these things that because they have the money, they can host, and they are willing to spend. And I think for a few reasons, one of them is publicity. Second of them is trying to, of course, win minds and hearts and minds over. It could be very specific hearts and minds. But also there is competition, especially between the Saudis and Emiratis. Project HQ by Saudi Arabia is trying to pull companies into Saudi Arabia by January 2024. They want businesses to be stationed and headquartered in Saudi Arabia, or they will not be given any contracts at all by January 2024. And that's one way of trying to pull the firms from Dubai and Abu Dhabi, for example. And there is a competition going now. And of course, the question then is, which city, has a more appealing living environment than the other, or which social climate or political climate is more stable? Is the ease of business better in this city than the other? Of course, Texas is there right now, but things like social entertainment. Can you consume alcohol? Can you go out for nightlife, for example? These are the things that come to the minds of foreign expatriates who come into these cities to work. And there are moves to change the landscape. So we will look at that in a bit. And now, we talked about Saudi Arabia. Now let's look at the UAE. And the legal reforms by the UAE started at the end of 2019, and now they are in place. But let's look at the list of them. All right, so we see that this the showcase of legal reforms is by Arabian business, and for good reason, because it's showing that the UAE is trying to pull ahead of the rest in terms of, like what I just said earlier, creating a conducive environment for doing business and a desirable place of residence. In other words, attracting foreign professionals. And that's very important, especially for countries with small national populations, such as the UAE and Qatar. Their national segment of the population is about 10%. And of course, they rely heavily on foreigners to come in, especially in the service sector, but also on skilled professionals for some of the things that they do, advise, consultancies, and also, of course, investments. And this slide, actually, I wanted to show you that all these moves to bolster the economy needs to be considered in the context of the society. So all these moves that you just saw, cohabitation between unmarried couples, permitting alcohol consumption, what would that do to Emirati society? How would they take that? Would they accept it? How would they react? I think this is something to think about. Okay, all right. Okay, so before we go into specific examples, I want to introduce another concept, which is capital. Capital not as in not financial capital kind of capital, but what Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, who talked about cultural capital and social capital. He developed these theories while studying the French education system, but also when he was in Algeria, living in Algeria. And he did field work and later part conceptualized this theory of capital, where cultural capital means that it's an asset that you pass down from one generation to the next. Meaning to say, if your father or your mom were a doctor or lawyer, that level of knowledge, expertise would be there to pass on to the next generation, or to encourage your sons and daughters to pursue a similar kind of career, because you were there, you've been there, done that. You want your kids to pursue the similar path. So this is a kind of know-how, knowing your family, the kind of intangible asset transmission that's inherited by the next generation. Social capital, on the other hand, is explained by Bourdieu as connections, or sometimes social obligations. In general, networking, expanding your networks and being able to tap on them whenever you need them. So as you can see, the arrows here, social capital goes out horizontally, broadens, while cultural capital is passed down from one generation to the next. And that brings us to the family, because cultural capital is passed down by the family. But how is the family relevant to what we are talking about? Gulf Arab states. First, because of the kind of political system where kinship is very heavily entrenched in this political system. The family, you rule like a family. Basically, the ruling family rules. The style of governance is based on the family, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But right now, like I said, there are changes. You want to attract more foreign professionals, expatriates. So you want to move towards modern and inclusive society, but that also means to negotiate the tensions between nationals and non-nationals. How would you bring, the foreigner into the family, or at least regard that they have some kind of contribution to the family? That is point 2 and 5, as you can see on the slide. We'll come back again. And of course, 3 and 4, 3 being the traditions that are still there, lineage, because the family plays a very heavy role. Who's your father, who's your grandfather, what were their achievements, and so on. And this ties in with the discussion on national identity, and citizenship. We'll come back to that again, because some of them are giving golden visas, and the UAE, as a standout, as the distinct one among the other states, is the one that is granting citizenship to foreigners, but on a case-by-case basis decided by the leadership. So again, then the question is what is the criteria? How are you going to pick which foreigner to grant that kind of, to issue that citizenship? Because with that citizenship comes the benefits, all the benefits that come along with that passport, right? And of course, the final number 4 is performance accountability. You have ambitions, you have visions. Can you be transparent enough to let your people know that this is how far you have progressed, and you have now a very active youth, which demands more from the leadership. So what happens in the near future? Will you be able to give them the opportunities that they desire or not? So we start with the political system, and I won't read everything on the slide, but you can see that there is dynastic monarchism, meaning that each country has a specific ruling family. UAE is a bit different. It's a federation model of 7 emirates, and each emirate has its own ruling family, but the paramount one is from Abu Dhabi. But the role of ruling families, really, what changed from then and now is that it used to be an interplay between the rulers, the merchants, and the tribal sheikhs. But in the modern state, things have changed because everything is institutionalized, everything is codified, formalized. So that kind of consensual power sharing is now within the ruling class itself. So if, for example, if you take the Al Sabah Sheikhs from Kuwait, they will usually take up what they call three vital positions in cabinet: interior, defense, and foreign affairs. And these will be divided to the two most crucial branches of the ruling of the Sabah family. And I won't go into that, but essentially that you are doing a kind of accepted power sharing within the ruling class, within the ruling family. And the same applies across the board, of course, with some exceptions. Oman is, of course, ruled by a sultan, so it's slightly different. But in general, there is a ruling family, and the kind of leadership or the successor, it taps into members of that ruling family. And this is the reason why I said the UAE is a bit different, because you have 7 emirates, not just Dubai and Abu Dhabi that we know more commonly, but you have Fujairah, Sakhema, Kuwain, Ajman, and Sharjah, which each has a different character. Sharjah being the most conservative, the lot. So if you saw the legal reforms just now in the clip saying that alcohol is permitted, in Sharjah it's not permitted. So even though it's a federal decree is issued, it might not be taken or accepted or implemented, is the word, by every single emirate. Okay, so there are differences still, although they belong to the same federal model. Okay. Now we move on to society and negotiating ethnocracy, which is actually negotiating the non-national. And of course, how do they progress towards creating a modern and inclusive society? Now it's a bit wordy here, but I'll simplify it. Ethnocracy, you see the pyramid, as Longva conceived, is saying that there is a hierarchy and there is a domination by ethnic group or by citizenship. In this case, obviously, the one that has the highest amount of welfare benefits or, say or voice is the Gulf male citizen, and then it goes down Gulf female citizen, and then the Western professional, and so on. And the bottom of that pyramid are Asian domestic workers. Of course, things have changed since she wrote that in 1997, and then again revised it in 2005. Today, in 2023, Gulf states are advocating for tolerance. I think in the UAE, there's a Ministry of Tolerance and Coexistence, which aims precisely to introduce that sense of respect between members of their population, whether you are national or non-national. And also, there is a differentiation between personal faith and state religion, meaning, for example, again, in the UAE, you are allowed to practice your own faith, which may be different than Islam, which is specified and stated very clearly in the state's constitution, in the UAE's constitution. Now, there is a realization that you require or you need the contributions of your foreign population, your foreign segment of the population. And this dealing with ethnocracy is one way of creating a more conducive environment for foreigners to come in. If you are going to be anti-foreigner all the time, and yet you require their contributions, and that is going to be a problem, which will create tensions and conflict, right? And now we talk a bit about lineage, tribal ties, and customs and traditions that still matter. Before we move on, let me just go back quickly to say that, of course, youth and women will be a lecture in itself. But even that has improved over the years. Female representation in the workforce and in politics have gone up. In the Federal National Council of the UAE, which is the advisory council, you have 50% who are women. In the UAE cabinet, 9 ministers are females. So you see that, that there is a concerted effort towards moving forward. So lineage, tribal ties, custom and traditions. Now, I want to take you back to the visuals that I showed you in the urbanization process. And this is Kuwait. 1930s, like I said, interconnected houses, mud houses. By the 1960s, you see some of the houses removed. You see some gaps. If you look at Kuwait from above, you see some gaps. You see the development of the road starting to appear, and voila, you see this is the concentric ring roads that we see today. And so now, like I asked very early in my presentation, what happens to all those communal spirit when you start dispersing your families, which were once extended families, into single villas, nuclear families? How are you going to bring them together? And that is where I talk about the family. What are the new policies, new programs that are introduced by the state to rekindle that kind of communal spirit? Now, you see, there are moves, and my colleague, when he did the introduction, that I was studying the majlis, or the councils and reception rooms in the region. These rooms are places where the family come together, and traditionally they are male preserved. So the males of the family will come together and get together in the majlis, and these are places where objectified cultural capital, meaning the family trees, the portraits and pictures of the ships, their uncles and fathers and grandfathers who were previously ship captains or pearl divers, are there in black and white and framed to remind the next generation that this was what used to be old Kuwait or old Dubai or whatever it is. And these are reminders. This is of course the family trees. Like I said, Emirati students still carry their lineage booklets along with them to classes. They still look at them and see which family line they belong to. And now, of course, it's also digitized. You can go online and look at your roots, at your family tree, your family lines. And from the part of the state and the Ministry of Community Development, for example, they issue marriage grants to encourage Emiratis to marry Emiratis. And of course, part of the aim is, of course, to preserve that national core. And it brings us back to the citizenship discussion, because if the UAE is issuing citizenship to foreigners, would these new citizens also be imbued with this idea of what it is to be Emirati, or what it is, or the traditions of being an Emirati? There is going to be a problem, because the current citizens will say that, if you grant them citizenship, will they be do they understand our culture? Do they understand our tradition? Do they understand our norms? So now the question is, how are they going to do it? Citizenship was once Gulf citizenship. It was once a coveted prize. Now it's being issued starting with the UAE. So is there going to be a tier-based system? It's going to be like, say, if I grant you citizenship, you only get this limit. There is a ceiling to it, for example. So these are the questions that are ongoing, the changes that are ongoing, the debates that are being discussed at the minute in the leadership and in society. And finally, we talk a bit about performance accountability, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Which I said, ambitions, of course, are generally well received, right, by the population. But then the society will always be watching their leadership to find out whether there are tangible outcomes, particularly on issues affecting everyday life, livability, employment, the nationalization of certain jobs. And there's an anecdote, because in social media, there was, for example, one recruitment drive by Citibank in Dubai. And the clip showed an expatriate inviting applications from Emiratis. And that triggered a social response, because they're saying, why am I trying to get a job from a foreigner in my own country? You see, this is the kind of debates that are being stirred on the ground, precisely because we talked about negotiating ethnocracy, but now there's a move or trying to change their mindset to negotiating meritocracy. That you are gaining the job, you are taking the job based on your credentials, rather than based on your ethnicity. So I wanted to finish this slide to say that to reiterate the fact that half to one-third of the Gulf populations is now made out of youth under 25 years of age. And social media now serves as an important pressure point for societal stress relief, venting, or sometimes an indicator of public approval or disapproval. But for now, across the board in general, there is a high level of loyalty and trust in the respective political leaderships. Perhaps with one exception, which is Kuwait, where there's still domestic instability in terms of their politics. But the degree of local nationalism is high, and we saw with the visions, because there is, from the leadership, a willingness to put out these visions, a willingness to put out these ambitions into projects. And I think one example or one manifestation of this kind of nationalism is we see in the football sector, football sports arena. We've seen the World Cup. The World Cup has shown that an Arab nation can actually host a World Cup. We've seen also Manchester City, owned by Abu Dhabi, winning the Champions League. And they came back to Abu Dhabi with all the parade and things like this. And there was a trending hashtag going on in social media. The hashtag meaning City Daiman Mansur, meaning city is always victorious. And that's the kind of nationalism that has been circulating within the population. And now, more recently, is the Saudi fever in terms of their sovereign wealth fund, the PIF, granting funds for four Saudi clubs to buy players, world-class players. And then you see the list. I think you may, if you follow football, you would know Fabrizio, and he gives the latest updates and look at the top 10, the list of top 10 acquisitions by Saudi clubs. Cristiano Ronaldo, of course, started the process, but there are now many more who have joined the Saudi ranks. So with that, I will conclude today's presentation, because I think we unpacked quite a fair bit for today. And I think it's fair to say that the Gulf Arab states is an exciting time for them. The Gulf Arab states are in the thick of socio-economic transformation. There is a flurry of diplomatic activity at the interstate level. I think this has been covered in the last few lectures. But at home, the concern is always been whether society can keep up. There's always been the question whether the Saudis are moving forward too fast and too far ahead, or are they getting ahead of themselves, really? Because the UAE did it for over a couple of decades and so on, but now the Saudis are trying to do it in 1 decade, or maybe, faster than that. And of course, we are going to bring back the notion of capital. There is an accumulation of social capital, or a drive to accumulate social capital and harnessing it into economic capital among the Gulf states. But there's also now more than ever a constant eye on retaining cultural capital, to say that, we need to put an eye and watch that we have a national core, to preserve that national core, to, put an emphasis on the family unit, which has already undergone an upheaval during that earlier modernization, urbanization phase, as we saw from the various visuals that we had on the slides. So now the challenge, really, besides the mindset change that I talked about, is to continue to respond to a youthful population, but also staying competitive in a global economy. And that drive towards economic diversification, towards winning themselves off oil, must be sustained in order to get there. And of course, they have to, at the same time, equip and train their own nationals with the necessary skill sets. So with that, I finish. I think I will hand it back to Asif.
Thank you so much, Clemens. It was really intense. Shows that you have really lived this research, what you have just presented in the form of lecture. Now we will get back into the question and answer round. Those of you here, maybe we can start. If you have any question, Patrick, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Patrick. Okay, it's very good that you've been talking about the upside, and your concluding remark, you hedged it. You made valid assumptions about this change happening in a generation. I would take it about 40 years. A lot can happen in 40 years. But just a question about the hedging the downside. What are the Gulf states doing to ensure that this generational shift can be protected from external threats? One example I can give is, let's take NEOM. Let's say it's a wonderful success, but happen chance state piracy becomes a new policy for, let's say, Mediterranean powers or Indian Ocean powers. If I block the Red Sea, no matter how wonderful NEOM is, in 1 year, its people will starve and the whole city will collapse. And your generational shift of 40 years is destroyed in 1 year. Yeah, so the basic question going back is, what are the Gulf states doing to protect this generational transformation?
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Patrick. I think on the Red Sea, the person should be asking is actually my colleague down there. But I mean, the strategy in terms of protecting their generation and protecting a specific part of the kingdom, for example, is precisely what they are doing now. They are moving forward to take regional leadership under the current crown prince. They are trying to make friends with everybody, ranging from BRICS and now the India-Middle East corridor. They are venturing out and not just staying within the Gulf region. And of course, Dr. John Liu, my colleague, also talked about Israel, and there's always been dealings with Israel under the table, whether or not relations have been normalized or not. So these are the kind of overtures that the Gulf states have already taken, and now we are in a climate of regional de-escalation, which is precisely the best time to kick off all these investments and, without much risk. Of course, how long that this climate of regional thaw and détente will last, that is another story. And I think the threat of Iran, the threat of Iran, which has always been there, now is also being dealt with by the Gulf GCC states themselves. Saudi Arabia, with China being the broker, the peace broker, has signed an agreement with Iran as well. So again, that's another sign that whole slew of newfound diplomatic relations will actually bode well for the future in terms of protecting the assets at home. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other question? Aisha, please.
So thank you very much, Clemens, for insightful presentation. You mentioned that with the economic diversification, we are seeing more of a competition between the countries in the region. My question is, even though there is a competition, but the Gulf countries has also established the Gulf Cooperation Council, which aims to promote for the economic and security integration in the region. Don't you see any signs especially for the economic integration, that allows, for example, the flow of human capital between the Gulf countries, or something similar to what we see in Europe, like the Schengen visa for the tourists, so they don't need to apply for each country? For me, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years. At the time, I barely met any Omanis when I worked there. So I wonder if you see any signs of integrations.
I think I'm going to respond in a few levels. First level, I would say, Aisha, you probably know better than me in terms of movement of peoples across the intra-Gulf borders. Two, I think there are signs. There are signs of optimism. We saw some railway projects already. And there's another one that will go in from Saudi to Oman, and also UAE to Oman. So I think we are seeing some signs where this could happen. I mean, Etihad Rail right now, like I said, is only operational in terms of cargo services, but the next move will be passenger services. And I think, why not? Why not? Because that also means a circulation of social capital and economic capital within that region itself. You're spending money on tourism within that small part of the Middle East, within the region, and I think there's a lot of money to be spent. And it talk about people to people movement. I think I think in terms of, you have to look at the land borders as well. For some, it's easier to cross than the other. Saudi Bahrain is one of them, as you know. And the next question is also, of course, whether they have truly recovered from the episode that happened from 2017 to 21, which is the boycott or blockade of Doha, whichever term you prefer to call it. And whether, because that's also a rupture in terms of kinship ties. Kinship has always been an important element of Gulf societies, and you may have a Saudi citizen who has a Qatari relative, for example, and that period of time, relations were ruptured, you were not allowed to travel. The question is it now really back to normal? I think we have to ask the families on the ground themselves whether this is really back to normal, but they seem to be actually advocating that there's a sense of normalcy, we will turn the page and things like this. But again, like I said, there's a sense of optimism. How long this will last, we don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Clarence. We have some questions from the floor which are really related to international relations, so I'm not taking them. I would request the audience if they could confine themselves questions on domestic policies and social reform in the region, because this lecture is primarily focused on that. We have other lectures for other issues. Is there any other question from the floor?
Thanks, Clement. Yes, I just want to ask about a lot of the Gulf countries, like many countries in the world, they're reforming their visa criteria to attract global tech talent. As you know, global tech talents tend to have a very disruptive kind of way of doing things, management and everything. And they also tend to like cryptocurrency, which also is another issue. So how does that contrast with the current social norms, including like Islamic banking and all its principles and values? This is when they move into digital economy.
So the Islamic banking, crypto, you're saying? I don't think I can answer that question fully. But all I know is that, for example, you have Binance, who is operating in the UAE, and they have offices. Because I know that, because I have a friend who works there. And generally, I don't think I can answer this question fully, really, to be honest. But they would have to navigate the structures, the power structures in place, and the social structures. I don't think there will be an exception. Perhaps in terms of KPIs and achieving their targets, then that is another story. But in terms of navigating what is going on in the country, I think it applies across the board. If you come to Singapore, your company would have to navigate through our guidelines, and which was Binance not being able to do that here. But now they are being able to do that in UAE, which means I guess they succeeded in doing so.
Thank you so much. In the meantime, other questions are coming. I'm not actually asking you a question, but in terms of further elaboration of what you have already said, we have talked a lot about the kinship, and what we have been seeing in terms of reform in Saudi Arabia. It's a family issue, right? The son has been following certain policies, whereas the father is already there. So what was really preventing previously that these developments were not happening when MBS was not a crown prince, right? That's one. The other thing is that since King Salman is already there, so is it happening as a king? So is it happening through his blessings? There's some intriguing, curiosity I have, if you could elaborate on that. What exactly is happening within the family, their orientation between the two generations in terms of their in terms of reform and Islam per se?
Okay, so your question is on the political leadership.
Not the political, but their orientation towards Islam, towards reform, not the power struggle part.
Yeah. So orientation towards Islam. I think the Crown Prince gave an interview, and he stated very clearly that Islam must keep up with the times. he was asked whether Saudi Arabia is still following the Wahhabi doctrine, and he said that Islam must keep up with the times. It can't be a sole doctrine that we follow blindly, to put it simply. Of course, I'm not saying it word for word, but that's the gist of it. When you talk about the father-son relationship, I think this has to be considered on a case-by-case or issue-specific, let's just say. So, for example, and the normalization of relations with Israel, Saudi normalization of relations with Israel, this probably, and again, this is pure speculation, but then again, you have his father who was there during the time when the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 was there in place. Whereas a younger generation and the generation to which the Crown Prince belongs to probably does not subscribe to that thinking that we must have a two-state solution in order for peace to be achieved. But then, because he is respectful towards his father's wishes and the fact that he belonged to a generation which witnessed, that landmark initiative, he doesn't push it. So I think that relationship, and on this issue, things might change, in the future when he ascends to the throne. Of course, there's also going to be a whole list of benefits if an external power wants to convince the two to normalize relations, and of course that is another discussion altogether. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Now on, if there is any question, I would really invite. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for the insightful sharing. I'm Alden from Hwa Chong. So my question is about the phenomenon or issue of religious fundamentalism, and how would you think that might affect the various ambitions and development goals that the countries have set for themselves? Yeah.
Religious fundamentalism, something that we look at the Institute intensely because of the Islamic currents between the Middle East and Southeast Asia, for example. Of course, right now, with all this push towards modernization, and Saudi Arabia being one of the Gulf Arab states, which actually was a big funder of Islamic charities in Southeast Asia, has now turned off the tap. And I have a good friend who works on this subject. His name is Zoltan Pal. You can Pall, Paul or Pal. You can Google him. But the fact is that the money that goes towards these Islamic charities in the region has dried up. Precisely because of what we covered earlier. We covered the fact that there is a push towards modernity. Wahhabism is no longer the doctrine; it's a doctrine, and things like this. So religious fundamentalism, I think all along the Gulf Arab states have worked very closely with the US in terms of counterterrorism, and this will carry on. Counterterrorism is still part of the agenda. But if you talk about this kind of fundamentalism that is developed through Pesantren schools, Islamic boarding, I think that has changed. The landscape has changed pretty much.
Thank you so much. You had a question.
So my name is Bastien. I'm studying at NUS. And so I had the chance to study policymaking this semester, and while I understood how fundamental is policymaking to transform an economy or a country or its culture, I also learned how complex it can be to shape good and efficient policies. So considering that the Middle East countries don't have lots of experience when it comes to policymaking, or don't have lots of knowledge, where do they actually source that knowledge, and how?
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Those of us who have lived or actually stayed in the Gulf states will know very well that the source of knowledge that was your question comes from a group of advisors. There will be an advising team close to the leadership. You take the UAE, for example, each emirate, the ruler of each emirate has an advising team, whether it's towards city planning, tourism development. They have someone who is placed as the CEO of that department or of that directorate, who is in charge of assessing the situation and giving feedback to the ruler. And then, of course, the decision making comes from the top, but the advice comes from this team, which can comprise expatriates, expat advice. And also my colleague, John Liu, was also part of the National Defense College, which also shows that, there is also a team that advises the defense sector as well. So there is always a hired team that will do that job.
Yes, thank you. And just let me see if we have any more questions from online. Just give me a second. Okay. One question from my side about rentier state, because you have delved in it a great deal. And because a lot of reform, as you said, no taxation without representation, things like that, a lot of things related to political reform is linked to that. As I look at it, since the inception of Islam, Makkah and Medina being in Saudi Arabia, they have a mindset of this rentier. Not exactly theory came very late after the oil came. So how do they really intend to get out of this mindset, from this rentier state mindset? The government has been trying, but how will it affect the society to come out of this mindset and adopt this taxation or get ready to do that? Is there any possibility?
Is there a possibility of coming out of that rentier mindset? Difficult. I think difficult because they have been so used to it, and because they're still enjoying the benefits of that model right now, even though there is a push towards encouraging entrepreneurship. There's a push towards encouraging startups, especially in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But, if you look at the figures, and you saw the diagram earlier, the public sector is still saturated, is still bloated. And without that shift, I think the physical shift of employment, people going into the private sector, you always stay. People must see that going into the private sector isn't so bad after all, and that you can also have the same kind of earning power, if not more or better, than if you were to stay in the public or government sector. And I think the other problem is a mismatch between your skill set and what the government offers you. And I often hear that, especially from Kuwait, where they say that I have this skill set, but the government put me in this job, which doesn't utilize what I'm good at. And I think that's also another thing, if you're doing nothing or doing something that is not useful to your position, your job position, but yet you're getting money for it, would you leave? I think that is another question you have to ask them. So yes.
Thank you. And a related question from online audience, Arbab Alamgir. He is basically asking about, is there a possibility in the Gulf societies to have some sort of combination of kingship and democracy? I think you have done a lot of work in these countries. The possibility to have sort of combination, or is it, from my side, is it already there in existence?
Kingship and democracy. I think that somewhat ties into the kind of customs and traditions that I talked about earlier. It's not democracy in the Western sense, for sure, but it's democracy in terms of consensus. And it's a kind of implicit tribal consensus. It's the idea of first among equals. So within the ruling family, I have all the sheikhs, yes, but they agree that you will be leading us. So there is a consensus. That democracy is not the kind of democracy that we are talking from a very Western angle, where you have elections and all that. That is simply by sitting down, seeing you face to face, and I say, okay, you be our sheikh because you are the most capable. And that's democracy in that sense, and not in the Western conceptual sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it has been a very learning experience for all of us. I have learned a lot. Feeling tempted to ask you a lot of questions, which I will ask later. And before concluding this session, I think I must thank everyone available here as the audience and online on Zoom. And for their question, I thank you for your lecture. Also thank MEI for organizing this MEI series. And we welcome all of you. The next week, the session will be on oil and gas. We will have another Singaporean scholar, Dr. Lee Chen Sim from Abu Dhabi. So we're looking forward to that lecture as well. With this, I bid goodbye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.